You know, I told you that for the rest of Easter, the readings are from John, and that there's a poetic language in John. There's this play on words that happens over and over. I mean, it's every chapter, but it's somewhere in every other chapter, nearly, if not that much. And so I want to stress some words. I want to read. Put that back up, will you, Cheryl? I want to stress some things as I read through this, and I want you to help me with it. John 10, 22 through 30. The first thing you notice is that it says, at the time the festival of the dedication took place in Jerusalem. That's important. It was winter. And Jesus was walking in the temple in the portico of Solomon. So the Jews gathered around him, and they said to him the question that probably many of us have asked before too: how long? How long will you keep us waiting? If you are the Messiah, say this with me, tell us plainly. Say it again. Tell us plainly. Have you ever said that to God? Well, if you're real, get here now. Get here in front of him. And did you ever think about what you'd do if that really happened? I have. I'll tell you, that's a funny story, but it's one for another day. Jesus said this. Say this with me. I have told you. Again, I have told you. And then he said, and you do not believe. Say that. You do not believe. Wow. You ever heard God say that to you? I've told you. You do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name give a testimony to me. Do you see the play? I've told you. You don't believe, and there is a testimony. And here you go. But you, say this with me, do not believe. You do not believe because you do not belong to my sheep. See how many times do not believe shows up? Say this with me. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. Look how many things God does here. I know them, and then I, what? Give them eternal life, and they will never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand, because what my Father has given me is greater than all else, and no one can snatch it out of the Father's hand. Father and I are one. Anytime you see that many words reappearing in a piece of prose, it was either terrible prose or it was originally a piece of poetry. Someone was rambling on. So I want to share with you some of the poetic nature of John's Gospel and some of the poems of St. John of the Cross, the great 15th or 16th century mystic and Christian. Today I want to read a poem called, Is That My Fate? Do they prove anything to you, these tears that I cry? All that I had I laid outside that door where I was told you lived. And someone took those gifts. Was it you? Were they that worthless that no thanks was ever given? That must have been the case, for I heard not one word of gratitude. Has it ever happened that a lover courting a lover has not offered trinkets? Surely you did not begrudge me for that. In the world of amorous play amongst your forest creatures, I have tried to learn some secret about love to bring you as near as they did, for I see how happy you made them. The flame called the moth, but the glass pane was there. How many have died in the fire, but in the cold, created in longing? Is it the fate of any heart not to reach you? Is it the fate of any heart not to reach you? No, no, that is not the fate of any soul. Well, I'm excited about Bible study tonight. I'll tell you what we're going to do next week. I was kind of keeping a secret what we're doing tonight. But tonight, I told you this was a place to be safe and explore new ideas. We're going to watch God, the Devil, and Bob. Did anybody ever see that short-lived animated series? We're going to watch an episode of that. And we're going to talk about two things. We're going to talk about, first of all, what was it about this series that the author of the series considered theological? You know, there's a theology behind it. And then we're going to talk about why some people found that so offensive. Okay? The first scene takes place in a bar. And so maybe that was part of it. You know, I wasn't going to say this. Some people put these on the internet, but I'm going to reach out here. Y'all have all read about the church that went into the bar to play, right? And they've taken a lot of criticism for that. And I think I can speak to that because I've done church and I've done the bar. All in the last 24 hours, so to speak. Well, not really. I wasn't in a bar last night, but it was the next best thing. It was outdoors. So I've been reading all the criticisms that a group from a Church of Christ, you remember those folks. They're our cousins, right? They're our a cappella cousins. Are y'all with me? And I love them. When I'm doing harmony work in the recording studio, I find somebody who went to the Church of Christ all their life, and they can hear harmony. And I love it. And I love my cousins in the Church of Christ. So please, don't read anything into this other than what I'm saying. But people were so critical of this group of musicians from the Church of Christ going to the bar to play music and evangelize and sing about God's love to people in the bar room. And nobody stopped to point out the fact that they couldn't have played those instruments in their home church if they wanted to, because it's against the rules in Church of Christ to play those. Now, I'm not dissing that. You understand me? If I'm in their house, we're doing it that way. Because I try really hard not to offend you every week. I realize some of you don't like the way that we all play guitar or piano. I realize that some of y'all don't all like the way I preach or the way that I think theologically. And I try really hard because if I alienate you from the beginning and the outset, I haven't done anything. You haven't heard anything. It's just a gut check. Are we all okay? Are we all doing that? Are we all coming here making sure that, yeah, so it's funny. I think it's great they play guitar. So I like this bar scene in Star Wars. Y'all seen that movie? I left the movie before the bar scene. 1977, my first date with my first wife. It's a long story. It doesn't end well. But here's what I know now. Here's what I understand. That barroom scene, do you remember that? Where you meet all these weird-looking people. Well, they're not really people. They're weird-looking creatures. And they're from all out there. And if you're Luke Skywalker, you're here because you're on a journey. You're on your way out there. And what does Luke Skywalker meet in the bar? But all the strange, scary people who have been where? Out there. Yeah. Guess what? Those weird, strange-looking people you were scared of, they're the elders. They're on their way back, man. They've been where you're going. They know something you don't know, and they're not really very good at communicating it to you. Really don't have time to talk to you. They're curmudgeonous. But here they are, and you want to approach them because you're about to jump off. You know that bar is the jumping off point. It's the outer limits. It's the boundaries. It's the edge of nowhere. And from here, there's nowhere to go but over the falls. You get it? You get it? If you're going to turn back, you probably should have done it before you got here. Wouldn't it be really something if the church could play that role in our culture? I wanted to put again at the end of that question, but I don't know. I mean, has the church ever played that role? Has that been the purpose of the church at any time, is to bring people to the launching point and send them over the falls? Wouldn't it be something if we were the outer limits and we were the jumping off point for the world? I went to church during a lot of different periods of my life. I went for a lot of different reasons. I don't know about you. The first reasons I went were the pretty girls that rode the church bus. And there I found out something about myself. I found out something I might have a weakness for later in life. Don't laugh at me, Sean. You did that last night. I love Sean. So I went to church during my formative years, of my teenage years, because I wanted to be good. I wanted to be right. You know, I was in a primitive Baptist church one time, And I didn't have nearly the hair I have now, but because my dad was a Marine, but I tested it every time he let me. And so I had little bangs or something, and the preacher was up there preaching 1 Corinthians 11:14. Does not nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him? And so I ran up at the end of the service and said, where do I go to get my hair cut and how should it look? And he told me, and I went and I did it. Yeah, I went to church to try to learn how to be good and to be close to God. I worked hard at that. And then I met Richard Rohr through his writings and eventually had the privilege of being in his presence. And he says things like, we work hard to do it right, but don't you ever notice that God comes to you exactly where you're doing it wrong? That you meet God, that you find God at the point where it's failing and it's breaking down, not at the point where you really have it all together. And that got to be really confusing. I mean, well then why should I keep doing these things? Why should I pray? Why should I study the Bible? Why should I try to be morally or ethically or even theologically correct? It got to be a paradox. That the very things I studied to be right with God were the things that prepared me to recognize where God was coming to me, exactly where I was breaking down. So, at the time of Hanukkah, the Gospel of John says, you know what Hanukkah is roughly, right? I mean, you've all got a general idea that sometime in the winter, around what we call Christmas, the Jewish people celebrate their own festival called Hanukkah, and there's the menorah and the 12 candles. The story is that the Syrian king, let me see if I can say his name. I had to write it down. Oh, I shouldn't have to write this down. Antiochus Epiphanes. That's easy to say. Epiphanes had gone into the temple and he had desecrated the temple by building an altar to his own gods in the center of the temple. Right in the very presence of God, in the most holy place in all of Jerusalem, Epiphanes creates this abomination. And the people live in oppression by the Syrian people for a number of years. And then in that period of time that passes between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there are these groups of Jews that rise up, led by a family called the Maccabees. And there's this thing called the Maccabean Revolt, and they actually drove the Syrians out and reclaimed the temple. So Hanukkah is this celebration of the dedication of the temple. They forcibly took back what had been forcibly taken away from them. And they rededicated it. The temple was again sacred and a holy place, a place of the presence of God. Wouldn't it be great if it were a jumping off point for people on the outer limits and on the edges? Because it's interesting that John also says during the time when they're celebrating the Maccabean revolt and the rededication of the temple and God restoring Israel through this revolt, at the time they're celebrating that, Jesus is walking in the portico, out on the porch, in the outer part of the temple, in the portico of Solomon. Do you know what goes on in the portico of Solomon? It is the outer court. If you've got an idea of the Jewish temple, it starts with all the people who are not really worthy, and then the people who are somewhat worthy, and then the people who are worthy, and in the very center is God in this room called the Holy of Holies. Whatever that room is for you. But there are these outer courts. And when you're on this very outer court, in the portico of Solomon, it is a place where everyone can gather. Now, if you're not Jew, if you're not part of the Jewish religion, you cannot go beyond the portico of Solomon. Wouldn't it be great if that was a jumping off point? Have you ever done prison ministry? There is a sign when you're leaving, you've seen it, Glenna, and it is a sobering reality. And I don't know why they wait until you're leaving before they give you this bit of information. The sign needs to be there when you're checking in. Because as you go out, you look at the gate that leads to freedom, and there's a big sign up there, and it's written to the inmates, and it says absolutely no hostages beyond this point. Why didn't they tell me that before I went in? That's crazy. There's a sign posted on the wall leading to the inner court of the temple, right at the edge of the portico of Solomon, and it says something like this. I'm paraphrasing, but it says something like, your life is on your hands. Your death is your responsibility if you go beyond this point. You get it? Wouldn't it be great? Is that where a jumping off point? Isn't that something? That it's a dangerous place to be. Why, if you were one of the kids at this church, you could wander in there and get snuffed out before you ever knew what happened, because and if you're one of the adults in this church, you probably wander off in there. It's sort of a place where, if you're not careful, what you do next, it could be your last move. And there in the portico of Solomon are all people of all tribes, all nations, all different tongues, and they're gathered there, and Jesus is walking amongst them. Anytime the Gospel of John uses this term, the Jews, what they mean is the religious right, the authorities in the Jewish temple system, the big cheeses in the church, the Jews. Now, Jesus was a Jew. Jesus' followers were Jews. A lot of the people walking in the portico of Solomon were Jews. But when the Jews come to talk to Jesus, that means something. And here they are, amongst all these people from all different places, and they're asking him a Jewish question right in front of company. Are you the Messiah? Are you the anointed? Are you the chosen one? Are you the one that God has sent? Are you our liberator? And why not at the time of the festival of the rededication of the temple, Hanukkah? Because if you think about it, in the minds of some of those people who are looking for a liberator, perhaps the last decent messianic figure they had was Judas Maccabees. At least he drove the Syrians out, and no one is standing up to these Romans. Are you our liberator, Jesus? And Jesus said, I've been liberating you since the day I started preaching. I've been liberating you since the day I started healing. I've been liberating you since the day I started eating and dining with sinners, and all you have done is criticize it. Well, he doesn't say it just like that. Jesus seems to have so little condemnation for people who most certainly deserve it. He says, you can't hear me. You can't hear me. But he says, my works are God's works. My works are God's works. God is present in the things that I am doing. Can you see that? My works are a testimony to the fact that God and I are one. Now, church, here's a little bit of an issue with the Gospel of John. You see, we have this thing that weighs on us. It's called Christology or Christology. And it's not bad and it's not evil, but we tend to think that everybody who wrote everything in the Old Testament and the New were thinking about Jesus and the Holy Trinity and all of the things that we know to be true about Christ. We think that everybody writing has that background information. In other words, when we hear the word Messiah, we think about the Son of God who cosmically saves us from the wrath of God, which we seem to still incur from time to time, yet have escaped to some great fatal degree. We tend to think of Jesus in the mystical sense, Messiah, as the one who doesn't really require much of this life, but he liberates me into the next life. But when the Jews ask for a Messiah, they want somebody who's ready to go to work today, and they have a clear idea what that means to them. And by the way, Jesus did not meet their definition any more than Jesus meets your silly definition. How long will you keep us waiting? How long will you keep us waiting? And so when Jesus says the Father and I are one, in our Christology, we go right away to, sure, He is the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and somehow there's a mystical thing happening there. And what John is saying is, look at God's work amongst the people, and there you will see that Jesus is the Christ. There amongst that work, He is the one. Now don't get mixed up. There's a great debate that's about 1,600 years old about, is it faith or works? And if I work too hard, is that faith? How am I justifying my life in God? Yeah, you really are. I mean, where are you through the week? I mean, we get here on Sunday and we pull it together at the last minute. Now what Jesus is saying is that if you want to see God, look among the people. Jesus is one with God because of the nature, the work that Jesus is doing. Look among the people. Look among the people. You see, I wanted to be a prayer warrior because I thought prayer would bring me closer to God. And so I learned to pray in so many different ways that I could twist your mind just talking to you about it. And all of them were meaningful experiences. But do you know when I met God was when I didn't have a prayer left. When my only prayer was, there was God. And you know what got me to, it was me. It was all that praying I was doing. Yeah. I wanted to know God, so I studied all about the Bible and about church and the history of all of it. And I've studied so much of it. I studied so much they put me on a fast track and took me to seminary. And in half the classes I went through, they asked me the questions. And I found God right at the point where I realized I don't know anything. All this stuff is mudding me up. And then I realized learning to pray was important. Learning to pray was important. Learning more about God and study was important because, well, there's an old saying, and some of you have heard me tell this before, but here it goes again. The disciple asks his master, what can I do to be closer to God? And he says, nothing, no more than you can do to cause the sun to rise tomorrow. You see, some things are already done. As far as you're justifying your life, quit. God did it for you. It's over. You're okay. Then why, the disciple says, why do you have me doing all this praying and all this reading? Why do you have me coming to church to do all this holy work? Make sure you're balancing your time, will you, please? We need help with the floors. We need help with the restrooms. We need help with the floor upstairs and the carpet. We need help with breakfast. We need help on the leadership team. And these things must and need to happen. And if they don't, we might shrivel up. It's true. But please don't let that be all you're doing here. Please. Because I will have failed as a pastor. And I'm a 3. I hate failing. Please. This is a place to pray. This is a place to be in the portico with all people and be challenged at the very moment, at the very place. This is a place to come and break down. And then please come help. Gosh, some of us are worn out. And if you're one of those, take a break. And if you need to give somebody else a break, give them a break. So if I can't do any more to be close to God than what I can do to cause the sun to rise, then the disciple asked the Zen master once more, then what is it that you have me doing? Why am I doing all this praying? Why am I doing all this studying? What's the purpose of it if I cannot influence or change God? And then the master says, so you won't be sleeping when the sun begins to rise. Stay awake. God is working. And look amongst the people. And look exactly where you didn't want God to be doing something. Look in your life, at the point of your life, where you thought you were getting it right. And then look to see where you're breaking down. What is it that just gets in there and does that to you? So that's the gentle nudging, the Holy Spirit. And when it's time, be prepared for the heartbreak. Pleases God to bruise the heart of a servant. You've got to know that some things are heartbreaking. To have a sense of compassion, you've got to know that some things are just heartbreaking, and you've got to be in it. Don't play the blame game. Right there is where you are awake and watching. More of you, Jesus. Less of me. Say that. More of you, Jesus. Less of me. I didn't hear you. More of you, Jesus. Less of me. More of you, Jesus. Less of me. Now don't say if you don't mean it. More of you, Jesus. Less of me. Will you pray with me right now?